So here we go with Lesson 1, Planning and Structuring Your Podcast. So firstly, why should you plan your podcast? Now, even if you're great at improvising, or if you have years of experience presenting, rolling into your podcast without any form of plan in place could lead to disaster. The best podcasters know what they're going to say. They have a plan to follow, even if it's a very loose one. Having a fail-safe to fall back on lets you play fast and loose with what you want to say without stumbling or adding ums and ahs into your sentences. Plus, the great thing about podcasting is it's all pre-recorded, so even if you're not completely happy with something, you can always go back and change it. So, should you plan for the month or for the week? Well, in our opinion, it's actually best if you do both, and here's why. A monthly plan can be a rough outline of what you want to cover, whereas your weekly plan can be more specific and allow you to drill down into the detail of each day of the week. So, for example, with a monthly plan, you can really take your time to think about the different topics you want to cover. You can jot down all of your ideas and then compile them together into weekly segments for your podcasts. At this point, they're essentially very rough and loose ideas. So, there may be a hot topic or event going on in your area that you think your audience may be interested in and that you may want to cover in your podcast. You can shift your schedule around, adding and pushing things back, so you can manage your time without compromising any of the quality. However, not knowing what you're doing for your podcast or what you're going to cover can be stressful and often get confusing. Even if you have a monthly plan, it's best to lay out all of your tasks on a weekly basis. So, take what you've already got from your monthly plan and map it out for each day of the week, like we've just done here. Now, even if you don't end up following this down to the letter, having a weekly plan like this gives you something to try to follow and stick to. Planning like this will allow you to make the best use of your time, which in turn will help you create a better podcast. In the radio industry, there's something called an on-air hour clock. It represents what a typical hour should look like, with talk, music and commercials. It essentially helps to answer questions like what needs to be covered during your show and the structure that will take. So, if we look at our example, we have a preview of what we're going to be covering, a sponsor message, the main bulk of our podcast, which in this example is an interview, and then we move into a competition segment before closing with our sponsor message and a preview of our next episode. Now, you can take this on-air clock and adapt it to fit your podcasts. Following this sort of structure will help you create a professional-sounding podcast, regardless of whether your show is 20 minutes long or 1 hour. Like radio and other spoken word formats, podcasts need a constant flow of engaging conversation to keep listeners hooked. And writing a script can really help you with this. Not only will you know what you're going to say next or the questions you're going to ask your interviewee, but you can avoid any awkward moments or dead air. Now, reading from a script can sometimes make you sound stiff and robotic. That's a huge mistake. A script should sound natural when read aloud. It's often fatal to write one too formally, as it results in unnatural sounding and boring podcasts. Always write with the thought of speaking naturally and with a good flow in mind. Alternatively, if you're given a script to read from, make some notes and read through it a couple of times so you're comfortable enough to say it in your own words. When you write your script, try and keep it as simple as possible. We recommend adopting the KISS method, which stands for Keep It Simple Stupid. Basically, don't cram your sentences full of unnecessary words which actually obscure what it is you're trying to say. Podcasts are at their best when they sound natural, whether they're fully scripted or not. So, if you make sure your grammar is concise and succinct, it'll allow you to improvise and expand on what you've written. Whether you're covering a serious story or just telling a joke, you have to remember that your listeners can't see what you're talking about. It doesn't mean you have to describe every single detail, But you do need to be aware that your listener may need a helping hand in visualizing what you're actually saying. So set the scene and tell them what they need to know so they can get a clear picture in their mind. So what should your script actually say? Now, although there isn't an industry standard as such, we've put together a brief overview that we think will help you with your script writing. Firstly, you need to split up your script into different sections. And like with any good story, you need a start, a middle, and an end. But most importantly, you need a compelling topic. Your topic runs as a theme throughout your show. So make sure it's something that is either going to be engaging for your listeners or it's something that you're comfortable discussing for longer periods of time. The beginning of your podcast should introduce the topic and summarize it for your listeners. The middle is the real meat of what you're talking about. So this is the section where you can go into plenty of detail. And finally, at the end, you need to have some sort of closure or summary for your listeners. So in this example, we're focusing on radio stations and how they're making the move away from traditional mediums like AM and FM to online. So although the start, middle and end sections of this are very brief, it kind of gives you the idea. The start sets up what we're going to discuss, the fact that radio stations are moving online, and the middle allows us to go into real detail. Finally, the end is an easy way to summarize everything nicely with the main point that we're trying to get across to our listeners. Now, in this case, we're saying that online radio is the future of broadcasting. And this is a typical format that we might actually follow for the Podcast.co podcast. Like with a radio station, a professional sounding jingle can really make your podcast stand out from the crowd. And it's also a really good way of conveying your message and adding some credibility to your podcast. So if you think about advertisements on TV and radio, for instance, they're short, distinct, and they leave a lasting impression with the viewer. Now, that's because they have a clear tone of voice, which in turn makes them instantly recognizable. So if you really want to make your podcast stand out, we recommend not just doing this yourself, but actually getting a professional in to record something for you. So these are some of the things we feel your voiceover or jingle should cover in order for you to get the most out of it. First of all, messaging. This really just needs to be a summary of what your podcast is about. So what is your overriding topic or theme? And also, what is your podcast's unique selling point? If you can get these things into your jingle, then you're definitely on the right track. Next, voiceover talent. So what type of voice do you think will fit well with your podcast? Should it be male or female, or young or old? Next, do you have a particular character or narrator style in mind? So for example, let's say you have a movie podcast. Well, then you may want to have someone with a movie trailer style voice deliver your jingle. Vocal tone. So how do you want the voiceover to actually sound? So is it corporate or casual? Is it energetic or somber? Is it soft or loud, reassuring or alarming? And something else to bear in mind here is accents and whether that should play into your podcast jingle as well. Target demographic. Who is your intended audience? Is it young or middle-aged, students or working adults? Understanding who it is that's listening to your podcast will enable you to create a much more compelling jingle that will resonate with them. And lastly, background music. Is there a type of music or even a range of sound effects that you can employ to amplify your message? And remember, the more compelling the message, the more likely it is to stick in your listeners' minds. So, to summarize, we need to plan our podcasts by week and by month. This will allow us to be organised whilst also giving us scope to add additional things into our schedule that we hadn't planned for. Structure your shows. Using our podcast clock format will allow you to create a professional sounding podcast that flows easily for the listener. Script what you want to say. It's incredibly important to be organised and precise with your listeners. Employ the KISS method, as this will allow you to keep your listeners engaged. And finally, get a branded voiceover or jingle, as this will enable your podcast to stand out from the crowd, whilst reminding your listeners exactly what your podcast is all about.